So I've seen a handful of movies this week. The first one is Val. This is a documentary on Amazon Prime about the actor Val Kilmer. This isn't someone I'm super familiar with. I know I've seen him in Top Gun and a handful of other things, but I didn't know all that much about him, so I was interested to see what type of things this documentary covered. It turns out Val Kilmer has filmed an astounding amount of footage throughout his life and his career. So there was footage from his childhood all the way up through college and up to modern day where he's much more famous. And it was really interesting to see how this guy progressed over the course of his life. I thought that the presentation of the documentary was kind of cool. One of the things that's covered in this is how Val Kilmer recently had throat cancer. And so he's been recovering from that, and it's rendered him unable to speak very well. That added an interesting dynamic to this because instead of Val Kilmer narrating the documentary, he had his son narrate for him. We got to hear his life through his son's words, which I thought was kind of an interesting way to play it. I don't watch documentaries all that often, so I don't know too much else to say about this. I think that if you're interested in Val Kilmer, there's definitely a lot of cool Val Kilmer stuff going on in this documentary. As someone who's a fan of movies in general, I thought that this was a cool piece documenting bits of movie history. I'd give Val a 7 out of 10. It's enjoyable enough, and I think that especially if you're a fan of Val Kilmer, you're really going to like this a lot. The next movie I'm going to talk about, it's actually two movies. It's Batman: The Long Halloween, parts 1 and 2. I'm going to talk about them as though it was one movie, because I think that'll just make it a little bit easier. The problems that I have with it are the same in both, and the things that I like about it are the same in both. So what do I like? I really love The Long Halloween just as a story. I think that it's a really great Batman graphic novel. It's probably my favorite. There's a handful of others that are up there too, but Long Halloween is always in the top 5. And so it was really cool to see that on a screen as a direct adaptation, and it's certainly a lot better than The Killing Joke. My God. They were able to adapt all of the core parts of this story in a way to where I thought that it was still faithful enough to the comic. I was enjoying it the entire time I was watching it. There were a handful of things that took some getting used to. One of them was the voices. At first, I really wasn't all for Josh Duhamel as Harvey Dent. I thought that it didn't quite fit the role, but I think that in part 2, that actually got a little bit better, and that could just be because I got used to it. I'm not too sure. Across the board, the voices were totally fine. The guy who did the Joker seemed like he was just doing a Mark Hamill impression, which I wish that that wasn't the case, but that's okay. I think that the best scenes in this were actually the ones with Calendar Man. Those are the ones that I enjoyed the most. I think that those were performed very well. I think that it was shown really well. It was just really dynamic scenes. Another thing that took some getting used to was the visual style, because I don't watch too many of these DC animated movies, so I had to get used to seeing just the way that everything's animated. Once I got used to it, that wasn't too big of an issue. My biggest problem with this movie was actually the changes that they made from the comic, because I think that they made the story a little bit worse because of it. Made it a little bit more predictable. I won't get into too many spoilers, but the twist at the end that reveals who the Holiday Killer actually is, I think was handled much better in the comic. In this one, I think that they were planting the seeds in a manner that was a little bit too obvious. I knew the twist going into this because I had read the comic book, but for someone who hasn't, I feel like it's much easier to guess because they were a little bit too obvious about it. And I wish that they were more subtle. I wish that some of the things that they included just weren't there altogether. And the way that they handled Harvey Dent in this was a little bit off in comparison to the comic. At least I thought so. I think that they revealed him to be Two-Face a little bit too early on, and it made it less impactful in this versus, again, in the... I know that I'm making that comparison a lot, but if you're going to make the change, you would think that the change would be in service of telling this story a little bit better, which is why I was surprised that these changes were made, because I think that they actually made the story a little bit worse. So that's why I keep making the comparison. Overall, I'd give Batman: The Long Halloween parts 1 and 2 a 6 out of 10. They were both perfectly enjoyable, but if I were to go into this story again, I think that I would rather read the comic book than watch these movies again. But on a plus side, these movies came with some kick-ass steelbooks, so I got those going for me now. Hell yeah. That's all for Val and Batman: The Long Halloween part 1 and 2. Thank you so much. Take care.